Right, thank you very much, and thank you to Professor Antoniazza for this very kind introduction. I hope the talk is going to live up to it. Thank you also to the British Society for the History of Philosophy for organizing this lecture, and indeed for inviting me to give it. Thank you to Professor Lerche for organizing it all in difficult times, and thank you to Professor Frazier for joining us as a respondent. Now, this is the first time I'm giving a public lecture from my office, and the irony that it's a lecture on solipsism is not entirely lost to me. So what I want to talk about tonight is the problem of solipsism in ancient Indian philosophy, and I want to talk about 4 different things. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit in general about the notion of solipsism, what it means and how we are supposed to understand it. Then I'll say something about solipsism in India and the various philosophical schools that have interacted or dealt with the notion of solipsism in ancient India. I'll focus in particular on an ancient Indian Buddhist school called Yogacara. So I'll say a little bit thirdly about their central ideas. And then in the 4th part, we'll be looking at 2 main Yogacara works on solipsism and some of the key arguments that are presented in there. So that's the menu for tonight. So first of all, let's look at the question, what solipsism actually is. Well, the central idea behind solipsism can be phrased in 1 sentence. We can either say it's the idea that only I exist, or we could regard it as saying that other minds don't exist. Now, these are 2 different ways of phrasing it, and obviously the difference matters. The second phrasing is neutral regarding the existence of the I. When I say other minds don't exist, I might either say that, well, I do exist, but other minds don't, or I might say that I don't exist and other minds don't exist either. Now, tonight, I'll generally be using the more general second phrasing. So understanding solipsism as the idea that other minds don't exist. Now, another way of seeing this is by distinguishing 4 different possibilities. The 4 possibilities there here on the slide. Number 1, I'm real and others are also real. Number 2, I'm real but others are not. Number 3, I'm unreal and others are unreal. And finally, number 4, I'm unreal and others are real. Now, the first is, shall we say, the natural view that assumes that both our minds exist and the minds of other people exist as well. The 4th position, I'm unreal but others are real, is a curious position we might want to call anti-solipsism, the idea that I'm a fiction but other people aren't. Now, I think it's quite an interesting position, but I'm not going to talk about it tonight. The middle 2, number 2 and number 3, can both be seen as forms of solipsism, as they agree on the unreality of other minds, though they disagree on the ontological status of ourselves. Right, so when we consider the view solipsism has of other minds, then we can distinguish at least 3 different ways of formulating the solipsistic position. First, we can regard it as an epistemological view, as a view about what we can know. And then the idea is that we can never know whether there are any other minds. Or we can regard it as an ontological view, as a view about what exists. And then we simply say there aren't any other minds as solipsists. And finally, we can treat it as a conceptual view. And the conceptual view would say that we can't even make sense of the concept other mind. Now, in order to distinguish these 3 different ways of formulating the solipsist position, it might be straightforward to compare that to different views we could have about the existence of God. And in fact, solipsism relates to other minds as non-theists relate to God. So the epistemological view is simply the agnostic view. We can't ever know whether there's a God. It's a kind of skepticism. And so in the same way that solipsists would say, we never know whether there are any other minds. Then secondly, there are the atheists. They say there is no God. As the ontological solipsist says, there aren't any other minds. And then there's a view, which in the theistic setup would be the view that we can't even make coherent sense of the concept of God. Now, these views get more extreme as we go down the page. For the ontological view, at least, the concept of other minds still makes sense. It just happens that there aren't any. And for the third position, the very idea of other minds is problematic. Usually, the ontological or the conceptual view are at issue when we refer to solipsism, and they'll be at the forefront of our interests tonight, too. Right, so now, having hopefully clarified a little bit what I mean by solipsism, I now want to have a look at the history of the philosophical position. So it's commonly assumed that the whole question of solipsism and whether there are any other minds should be located in the succession of the Cartesian cogito argument. And for the Indologists in the room, it might be interesting to note that Wilhelm Halbfass, mainly known as a specialist in Indian philosophy, actually had a former life as a Descartes specialist, and he wrote a book on that very question, Descartes' question of the existence of the world, in which he looked at the development of various solipsist positions in the succession of the Cartesian cogito. Now, the question is, of course, is that where it all started? So is solipsism basically a position that only becomes visible with the beginning of early modern thought? Well, if we go through the history of philosophy and try to find previous examples of solipsism and discussions of solipsism, it's actually quite hard. Some have suggested that the Cyrenaics might be an example. So here we would be about 500 years before the beginning of the Common Era. But whether that is actually a good example requires, I believe, a lot more investigation into the precise nature of their views. I have never been able to find any discussions of the solipsist position within Arabic and Chinese philosophy. If there are any specialists out there who have passages or works in mind, I'd be very grateful to hear about them. It is curious that these questions never seem to have arisen in these traditions, or at least weren't regarded as very important. However, we do find a substantial amount of discussion of the question of solipsism in ancient Indian philosophy, and we find it about 1,000 years before Descartes. And it's to the discussion of solipsism in ancient India that we are now going to turn. So when we're looking at solipsism in ancient India, we are looking at two main intellectual traditions. We find a discussion and potentially a defense, we'll see how exactly that works, of solipsism in Yogacara Buddhism, so a form of Buddhism that arose around the form of Buddhism that arose around the 5th or 4th century after the beginning of the Common Era. The first text we're looking at here is from the 7th century. And secondly, there is a classical Indian tradition, Advaita Vedanta, which includes a form of post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta with a view called Drishti Shrishtivada, which is a view according to which the world, Shrishti, does not exist independently of perception, Drishti. Now, this view has certain affinities with Yogacara Buddhism, and it is a view that really comes to prominence in the 16th century with a thinker called Prakashananda. And in fact, the doctrine of Drishti Shrishtivada took such a hold in Advaita circles after his time that one can meaningfully speak of an idealist turn in later Advaita Vedanta. And under this general heading, we find a particular view referred to as Ekajiva-vada, which is the view that there is only one jiva, only one person, and that there's only one self. Whereas for Advaita generally, there are many jivas, but there's only one self. Now, this view is chiefly associated with another 16th century thinker called Madhusudana Saraswati, and he even describes Ekajiva-vada as the main position of Vedanta. Now, tonight, time is limited, and so I won't have time to talk about all the different discussions of solipsism in ancient Indian thought. So I'm going to focus on Yogacara Buddhism, and we're going to leave Advaita Vedanta and its solipsistic forms for another time. Right, so first question then is, what is Yogacara Buddhism? Well, it is a form of Mahayana Buddhism systematized in the works of two thinkers, two half-brothers, as it happens, called Asanga and Vasubandhu, who lived in the 4th or 5th century after the beginning of the Common Era. Now, Yogacara is a technically very complex philosophical system. However, we can delineate its main forms by looking at a couple of key concepts. And now I just want to talk about 3 of those: Chittamatra, Alaya Vijnana, and Sri Svabhava. Now, Chittamatra is really the summary of what the Yogacaran wants to say, and that is the view that all things are merely matra, mind, chitta. So it's a form of idealism according to which there are no physical things, rather all the things are mental. However, we mistakenly regard them as physical by seeing mental stuff as if it was physical stuff. Now, a very central notion of the mental or the mind is the idea of the alaya vijnana, of the so-called foundational consciousness, which is the fundamental level of every mind, which exists in the Buddhist conception as the repository of all the karmic tendencies that beings have accumulated over many, many lifetimes. And it is often in Yogacara texts referred to as being like an ocean, and from the ocean rise the waves. The waves look as if they had a nature different from the water, but in fact they're just like the water. In the same way, conceptions of physical objects arise out of the alaya vijnana, but in fact their nature is purely mental. Now, this very idea is illustrated by Yogacara with the theory of the 3 natures, the Trisvabhava. We can illustrate what that means by a simple cinematic metaphor. So imagine you are sitting in a cinema and you're watching a film with of a tiger in the jungle. And you might feel afraid of the tiger as it suddenly moves towards you. So the Yogacara would say that the tiger corresponds to the imputed nature. The tiger is the bit of reality that is not there, right? Because there's no tiger in the cinema. However, there is something which is there, which is the patterns of light on the projection screen. They are really there. Those are the dependent nature. And the dependent nature corresponds to the alaya vijnana, it corresponds to this foundational consciousness on which then the imputed nature is superimposed. And then finally, there is the perfected nature. Now, that is not a third item in the cinema. So we already have the imputed nature, which is the non-existent tiger, and the dependent nature, which is the light on the screen. Now, the perfected nature is simply the absence of the imputed nature in the dependent nature. So it's the fact that amongst the pixels of light on the screen, there is no tiger. And realizing that is important for becoming enlightened. Right, so that's in a nutshell the fundamental idea or some of the fundamental concepts in Yogacara Buddhism. Now, looking at the key idea of citta matra, all things are merely mind, that is a fairly unintuitive position, we might think. So I think it's good to look at a couple of arguments for why one might actually think that that is true. And Yogacara came up with a variety of different arguments, and tonight I just want to look at three, which I regard as particularly interesting from a systematic perspective. The first is the argument from explanatory equivalence. The second is what I call the causation resemblance argument. And three, we have the constant cognition argument. Yeah? So without further ado, let us look first of all at the first argument called the explanatory equivalence argument. And this is the argument that we find in a very famous Yogacara text by Vasubandhu called the 20 Verses. And the fundamental idea is that Yogacara can account for a variety of features of our perceptions that we would usually think only the existence of material objects can account for. So, for example, our perception is spatio-temporally ordered. Things happen in a specific temporal sequence and are laid out in space. We also share experiences, so we can all look at the same objects. We have different perspectives on it, but we all see the same object. And finally, there is a specific resistance of these external objects. We can't just bend reality to our will, but things seem to determine how we perceive them. Now, all of these, the opponent of Yogacara would say, point to the idea that there is some external reality out there that makes that happen. Right? So our perceptions are spatio-temporally determined because outside there is stuff in time and space. And we have intersubjective experiences because they are external objects such that we can all look at them. And the resistance of the apparent world is due to the fact that there's really some stuff out there and it resists to our wishes and desires. Now, Vasubandhu says, well, all of these are things that the Yogacharin can account for. Let's look at the first, spatio-temporal determinacy of our perceptions. Well, it is the case that you can have such determinacy without there actually being any objects that make it so. Take, for example, dreams. In a dream, even though it may be very chaotic, not everything happens at the same time and not everything happens at the same place. So you have spatio-temporal structure in dreams, but nobody thinks that there are any dream objects that are laid out in a dream time or dream space such that your dream perceptions are perceptions of them. So it doesn't seem to be necessary that in order to have spatio-temporal determinacy, you need external stuff. Secondly, intersubjective experiences. How does that happen? How can we all see the same cup if there's no cup out there? Well, for that, Vasubandhu brings in the idea of karma and karmic tendencies. So the Yogacara idea is that whenever you perform an intentional action, it leaves some trace, some karmic trace in your mind stream, in the alaya vijnana. And when the conditions are right, these traces or seeds, as they are called, blossom or mature. And what do they mature as? They mature as experiences. Yeah? So when we have a couple of beings that all see the same thing, so say we are all looking at the same cup, then what is happening according to Yogacara is not that there is a cup out there and we all see it, but rather we have all similar traces, karmic traces in our minds, and they all mature or blossom in a coordinated manner so that we all think we are looking at the same cup, even though there's no cup out there. Yeah? So that's the way the Yogacara accounts for intersubjective experience. And finally, the resistance of supposedly external objects. Well, you have that in dreams too, right? So when you're trapped in a nightmare, there's very little you can do about it, even though the entities you dream about don't have any external reality. Yeah? So the Yogacharan says, well, everything that the believer in external objects can explain about perceptions, I can explain too. Yeah? That on its own, of course, doesn't really show you that Yogacara and its Chittamatra position is something that should be true. At best, it shows you that it is consistent and it is at least as good as in explaining perceptions as the realist view. But Vasubandhu joins this with an appeal to ontological parsimony, so-called principle of lightness, or Lagava. The idea is here that, well, the external realist needs two things in order to account for our experience. He needs to refer to physical objects, and he needs to refer to mental stuff, our perceptions. While the Yogacaran only has to refer to one thing. He only has to refer to mental stuff. So his position is ontologically lighter because it postulates fewer things. And if you've got two positions such that one is ontologically lighter than the other, and they both can explain the same things, then you should go for the lighter ones, and that is Chittamatra. Okay, so that's the first argument for Chittamatra we're going to look at today, the explanatory equivalence argument. Okay, number two now, the causation resemblance argument. Now that is a very interesting argument that is based on the idea that a perception must both resemble the perceived object and also have been caused by the perceived object. Now, if there's only causing but no resemblance, then what I would perceive, for example, when seeing flashing colors after ingesting a psychoactive substance, is the cause. So I would say I'm actually perceiving the chemical, which might strike us as at least slightly counterintuitive. We intuitively would think, well, what we perceive are the colors. We don't perceive the chemical that's doing the stuff in our brain. On the other hand, if there's only resemblance but no causation, then I cannot say whether the perception of a specific cup I might be having is a perception of it, or of a cup at the other end of the universe that might in fact resemble it more, even though it has nothing causally to do with my perception of the cup. So the argument here is that a perception must have both of these features. It must have the resemblance feature and it must have the causation feature. And now the Yogacaran argues that no external objects can fulfill both of these conditions for being a perceived object. Yeah? And so the argument is phrased specifically against an atomist opponent. The Yogacaran argues that atoms can very well be thought to cause the perceived object, but they do not resemble it. So a collection of atoms on my desk might cause me to see a cup, but the atoms are non-extended, the cup is extended, so it appears that they don't resemble it. On the other hand, collections of atoms, which collectively constitute the cup, they resemble my perception, but they unfortunately haven't caused it. The reason for that is that collections having parts are not ultimately real and hence have no causal power. Now, in order to see why this premise is introduced here, we would have to go a little bit back to various other ideas that Buddhist thinkers defend, such as the idea that wholes are not real, only parts are real, so a form of mereological nihilism, and the idea that in order to be ultimately real, something has to have some causal power. It has to have some sort of force of changing things in the world. Now, I think both of these positions are actually quite plausible, and strong arguments can be made in their favor, but this is something which we just have to assume for the sake of argument for the time being, because we want to move on now to the third argument, which is the constant co-cognition argument. Now, the constant co-cognition argument is usually phrased with the example of the awareness of a specific color, such as blue, and the idea is the awareness of blue are never experienced apart. Yeah? Now, the Yogacaran argues that we cannot differentiate blue and the awareness of blue by experience, simply because we never experience blue without at the same time having an experience of blue. So we can never take them apart by experience. But we also can't take them apart by inference. And that is because in order to have an inference, we need to base the inference on a pattern of mutual absences and presences of something being conjoined with something in some cases and not in other cases. And this we cannot have because we don't have a pattern of absences and presences in the case of experiences and the color blue, because they always come combined. Now, try to keep that point in mind, because that will become quite interestingly important in our later discussion of some of the solipsistic arguments. What we just want to note for the time being is that in the epistemological framework in which this argument is set, the only things you can use in order to find out something about the world are experience or inference. Now, if you can't use either experience or inference in order to tell blue and the awareness of blue apart, then you cannot differentiate the awareness of an object from the object, and therefore you might as well assume they're the same thing. Okay, so that's a kind of a whistle-stop tour through three famous and I think quite interesting Yogacara arguments. Now, there's obviously a lot to say on these, and we could spend more than one lecture just looking at these and various criticisms of them. I'm just introducing them here to you to give you a flavor of some of the Yogacara idea, and also give you a flavor of the intellectual sophistication that is put into place in order to defend some relatively unintuitive position, such as there's no material stuff out there. Yeah? So now that brings me really to the main bit of tonight's lecture, and that is Yogacara and the problem of solipsism. Now, it is clear that solipsism is a problem for the Yogacaran, because we might imagine an opponent saying, does Yogacara's denial of external objects not imply the non-existence of external mind? If the orange in front of you is simply a construction from my mental phenomena, why are you not merely a construction from my mental phenomena? Right? So Yogacara, as we have seen, is very good in producing arguments against external objects. Now, why can't we just use these arguments and turn them into arguments against external minds? And then, because we are in a solipsist position, according to which other minds are simply constructions from my mental phenomena. Yeah? Okay, so here one of the most famous Indian Buddhist philosophers, Dharmakirti, 7th century, the Common Era, enters the discussion, and he composed a monograph exclusively on the question of the problem of solipsism, the establishment of other minds, it is called. And this is, I think, the first systematic discussion of solipsism we find in the history of philosophy. So it's a very interesting text. And the argument or the claim that Dharmakirti makes in that text is that Yogacara can access the same resources for establishing the existence of other minds that are available to the opponent. Yeah? So he's saying, look, you as a realist who believe that there is material stuff out there, you can have a specific argument for the existence of other minds, and Yogacara is no worse. They can simply replay the same argument according to their own terms. So either external minds exist for both, or they exist for neither. So if it's a problem, it's not a specific problem for solipsism. And the way in which Dharmakirti tries to establish that position is essentially by an argument from analogy. So he's saying, suppose I see you wiggling your arm, so I perceive you raising your arm. Now, I can also know by introspection that no intention of mine to raise your arm has preceded raising your arm. So it wasn't that I was sitting there willing you to raise your arm, you just put it up. And thirdly, all actions are caused by some intentional state if they are caused at all. So that's simply a fact about human psychology. I think we can leave reflexes and things like that out of the picture for the time being. So if we accept all of those premises, then we are left in a position where we have two choices. Either you raising your arm has no cause, it just went up randomly, or your raising your arm is caused, but then it's caused by an intention that is not mine. Yeah? And what intention could that have been? Well, it must have been an intention of yours. Now, B is more plausible, it's more plausible to assume that your raising of your arm is caused by an intention that is not mine than assuming that it is that it has no cause at all. And therefore, we can assume that they are mental events separate from my own. Yeah? And the important point about all of this is that Dharmakirti says that the security or the power of this argument is independent of whether you are a Yogacara who believes that only mental things are real, or whether you believe that they're external objects, external physical things. Yeah? So the solipsist and his opponent, the idealist and his opponent are in the same position when it comes to inferring the existence of other minds. Okay, now we fast forward between 300 and 400 years to the 11th century, and we come to a very interesting thinker called Ratnakirti. Now, Ratnakirti really presents the last bit of Buddhist scholastic discussion before scholastic Buddhism disappeared in India at the beginning of the 12th century. So that makes him a very interesting thinker, because he had access to all of the interesting arguments and all of the interesting discussion that took place in the more than 1.5 millennia of intellectual discussion in India that involved Buddhism in some way. And he wrote another interesting text, a very short text, called The Refutation of the Establishment of Other Minds, obviously aimed at Dharmakirti, even though Dharmakirti is not named by name there. And he is trying to undermine Dharmakirti's argument, in particular this argument from analogy, and he claims that it does not work. So he says Dharmakirti's argument is based on inferring an unobserved property, namely your mental state, which I cannot observe, from an inferential sign, and the sign is, of course, your action. Now, to make this inference, we have to ensure that whenever there are inferential signs, your action, there is an unobserved property, your mental state, and that the inferential sign is absent when the unobserved property is absent. Now, to see how that works, it's probably easiest to look at a simpler example. So we're looking at the standard Indian inference here, where you observe some smoke on a distant mountaintop, and then you know that smoke is caused by fire, so you infer that there's fire on the distant mountaintop, even though you can't see the fire, you can only see the smoke. Yeah? So we have the inference there that there's smoke, so there's fire. And in order to support that underlying inferential relation, we have to know that if there's fire, there's smoke, and if there's no fire, there is no smoke. Okay, so this is how we have to back up the inference in order to be able to make this inference. Now, if we simply transpose that into the example that is at interest here, then we want to infer that there is action, so there is a preceding volition. Now, in order to support the underlying inferential relation, if there is volition, there is action, and if there's no volition, there's no action. These are two things that we have to know in order to be assured that we can draw this kind of inference. Yeah. And this is where Ratnakirti says the problem lies, because I can supply the support of the underlying inferential relation in my case, but I can't do so in your case. Yeah? In the case of my volitions, the structure of observation warrants the inference that if there is my action, there was my intention in the previous moment, say. Yeah? But in the case of your action, I cannot supply the support for the underlying inferential relation, because I cannot establish in a non-question begging way that when I observed your volition, I also observed your subsequent action, because I never observed your volition. Or if I did observe your volition, then this whole discussion would be superfluous, because then I could simply establish the existence of other minds by perception, but this is not possible. And secondly, when I don't observe your volition, which is all the time, because I never observe them, then I might either observe your action subsequently, or I might not, depending on whether I see you act or not. Yeah? So Ratnakirti says you might be able to establish a kind of inferential relation you need in order to run Dharmakirti's argument from analogy in your own case, but that's somewhat pointless because in your own case, you don't really need to infer that you yourself have a mind. What you want to infer is that the other guy has a mind. But in the case of the other person, you can never support the underlying inference because you can't establish this presence-absence patterns that you need in order to establish the inferential relation. So Ratnakirti fundamentally poses a dilemma. So he asks, are mental states of others perceivable or not? And there are two possible answers. Yes, they are, or no, they are not. Of course, yes, they are raises the question why we never perceive them. If they were just hidden from us, like, what is in the room behind the wall, then, and so the wall obstructs my view, this is why I can't see what's in the room next door, then I should at least sometimes be able to perceive them. For example, if I walk out of the door and go into the next room, then I can see what's happening there, but I can never do that with your mind. Yeah? However, if we claim B, that they're not even visible in principle, then the question is, how can we use them to establish a pattern of observations of these relative to observed actions in order to base an inference on this pattern, right? So if we need to establish this presence-absence pattern with volitions and with actions, however, we can never observe the presence or absence of volition, simply because we can't look into other people's mind, then we can never get the kind of inferential pattern that Dharmakirti thinks we need in order to get the inference going. Right, that is one of the key points that Ratnakirti makes. So he claims that the absence-presence pattern Dharmakirti requires to infer the presence of other minds can never be established. Now we might think, okay, well, that is, however, a problem that applies equally to attempts to infer any unobservable entity. So atoms, electrons, and so on, we can never perceive those either, but we could surely say that we can have a good inferential argument for the existence of electrons or the existence of atoms, say. Yeah? So it would be quite strange if we were in a position where we would have to rule out the possibility in principle unobservable entities postulated as the best explanation of some data. Right? So nobody has ever observed an atom, but you might still say they are atoms because atoms are the best explanation for the experimental data we have. Yeah? So if Ratnakirti's criticism then committed us to saying that we can never infer the existence of unobservables, we probably think the cure is worse than the disease. However, for Ratnakirti, other minds are really a particular problem. And he argues that the problem of inferring other minds is worse than that of inferring unobservable atoms, because atoms can at least be coherently conceived, but other minds cannot. Now, why is that? Well, Ratnakirti argues that if there was another mental continuum or another mind, let's call it B, separate from my own, which I call A, then I would perceive A, my own mind, either as distinct from the other mind, as non-distinct, or as both, or as neither. Now, I my mind identical with yours, so that rules out the second and the third possibility. And I also don't regard my relation to other minds as somehow indeterminate or indescribable, so that rules out the fourth possibility. So the first option is the only plausible one. I regard my mind as distinct from your mind. Yeah? Now, but what does that really mean? Ratnakirti asks. Now, we cannot perceive A as distinct from B without perceiving both A and B. But by assumption, we cannot perceive the minds of others. So we cannot perceive them as distinct from our own minds. So we cannot relate them in any way to our own minds in terms of identity and difference, because we can only relate things to us in terms of identity and difference if we can perceive them. And entities that cannot be so related to another entity are inconceivable. And this is why other minds are inconceivable. So you see here the move from the ontological to the conceptual problem of solipsism. Here the challenge seems to be that you can't even make sense of the notion of a mind other than your own. Okay, so there's a lot more in Ratnakirti's text that is of interest, but we don't really have the time to go into that. So I want to, rather on the basis of what I've told you so far, look at the resulting picture. So first of all, the dialectical situation. So we had Dharmakirti's treatise first that defends Yogacara against the charge that their position inevitably leads to solipsism via the argument from an analogy, saying that if the Yogacaran has a problem establishing other minds, his opponent will so too, and if the opponent can establish them, the Yogacaran can establish them. So there's no special problem for Yogacara. Now, Ratnakirti refutes this argument from analogy, and hence he refutes Dharmakirti's defense. Now the question is, therefore, is Ratnakirti now interested in arguing for solipsism? Now, it's quite clear that Ratnakirti's aim cannot have been to refute the Buddhist position in general, or the Yogacara position in particular. Now, Ratnakirti was a Buddhist and is commonly associated with the Yogacara school. So it's not entirely sure what is going on here. Now, could Ratnakirti have endorsed Yogacara as entailing solipsism, either of the ontological or conceptual kind? Well, no, because it's unclear how this would ever cohere with the Buddhist soteriological picture of us being unenlightened while the Buddha, a different mind, presumably, is enlightened, while they are bodhisattvas supposed to liberate countless beings if there are no other beings, and so on. So it seems to be that from a Buddhist perspective, solipsism is highly problematic, and so we should be very wary to assume that a Buddhist writer like Ratnakirti is going to defend such a thing. Now, another interpretative possibility that you'll often find in the secondary literature is that Ratnakirti's exposition is given from the perspective of ultimate truth. So the idea here is that solipsism could at best be endorsed at the ultimate level. So ultimately, there's no distinction between minds, there's only one mind. Yet, if the existence of other minds cannot be established by something like the argument from analogy at the conventional level, then how can it be established? Yeah? So even if we assume that Ratnakirti's exposition is given from the perspective of the ultimate truth, it's clear that what Dharmakirti wants to do is operate at the conventional level. He wants to argue for other minds at the level of conventional truth. Now, to which extent do we actually have any disagreement here? And that brings me to the central interpretative puzzle of the discussion of solipsism in ancient Indian Yogacara Buddhism, and that's the following. So, if Ratnakirti's treatise is a refutation of Dharmakirti's, then they must disagree on something, otherwise it wouldn't be a refutation. However, if Ratnakirti and Dharmakirti both accept that other mind exists conventionally, yet fail to exist ultimately, then they don't appear to disagree. So that is an interpretative option that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Okay, so now I want to come to the end by suggesting one possible solution to this puzzle. Of course, this is very much in the spirit of rational reconstruction, but I hope it is a potential solution that all of the participants in the debate might have endorsed. And the idea is that there are different kinds of conventional truth. Not all conventional truth are the same. So some conventional truth dissolve when we subject them to conventional analysis. Yeah? So take, for example, the conventionally true fact that the sum of the interior angles of a triangle equals 2 right angles. This is false when you transpose it to the surface of a sphere. Yeah? Now, this is a conventional truth that you might want to call a brittle conventional truth as opposed to a robust one. So a brittle conventional truth is a truth that is, it's something that works in practice and enables us to achieve our goals, such as dividing up land. And in general, it's a good idea if you are trying to divide up land to assume that the sum of the interior angles of triangles equals 2 right angles. Yet once we dig deeper into that truth, it actually shows itself to be false. It doesn't hold with full generality, it only holds on a flat space. Now, the digging deeper here is not an ultimate analysis for example, in the Madhyamaka sense of the term, searching for substantially existent entities. No truth would measure up to that standard. But it's an analysis in terms of other conventional truth. So the idea would be that the existence of other minds is a conventional truth for both Ratnakiti and Dharmakiti, but it's not a robust one, it's a brittle one. It's one that dissolves under conventional analysis, and it dissolves under the conventional analysis of Ratnakiti's arguments. So again, we can put this all together in a nice table. Okay, so here we have a table of the different types of truth. Now, we have conventional falsehoods, like London is the capital of France. And then we have two sets of conventional truth, the brittle ones and the robust ones. Brittle conventional truth are, for example, truth like two events simultaneous for one observer are simultaneous for any other observer. Now, that works in most cases, but once you dig a bit deeper into the physical foundations of all of this and look at very large distances, you realize it no longer holds. Yeah? So that is how it differs from a robust conventional truth. For example, the mass of the moon is smaller than that of the Earth. Even if we dig deeper conventionally, that truth is still going to stand up. And then, of course, there is the realm of ultimate truth, what the Buddha knows, all things are without self, for example. So that's a completely different set of things. Now, we can conceive of the disagreement between Dharmakiti and Ratnakiti, and you remember the puzzle that I posed there is, what do they actually disagree about? We could phrase that disagreement in terms of the question whether the idea that there are other minds, whether that is a conventional truth that is brittle or one that is robust. Now, Dharmakiti would argue that the existence of other minds is robust because we can support it by thinking about other conventional truth. We think about introspection and we think about how we ascribe actions to others, and then we can develop an argument for why they are other minds. And Ratnakiti agrees that the existence of other minds is a conventional truth, all right, and that means we need to rely on it in order to act successfully in the same way in which we need to rely on the sum of the angles of a triangle being 180 degrees if we want to achieve correct measurement in most contexts where we are likely to measure something, like if we're measuring the size of a field or something like that. However, this conventional truth does not hold up when we reflect about the conventional practices that seem to be able to support it. If we reflect on our inferential practices and how our observations are used in order to support inferential relations and our practices of establishing identity and difference and so on. So Ratnakiti and Dharmakiti agree that the inference that establishes the existence of other minds might be an intellectual bridge that we can cross, but Dharmakiti and Ratnakiti differ in how much weight we can put on that bridge. And that is really all I want to say tonight. So I now hand over to Professor Frazier for some comments and response.
Yes, let's first thank Jan for really a terrific lecture, really wonderful. I have spent myself many years with Leibniz, and I was imagining Leibniz sitting next to me and taking notes and thinking, all things are merely mind. Yes, yes, I have to engage with these guys. And indeed, that is exactly what we should be doing a lot more, engaging with these guys, because these lectures has shown us that there is such a richness of topics which really are at the center of our philosophical discussion. So I now ask Jessica Fraser to help us starting the discussion. And then if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There is a little hand on Microsoft Teams. If you click that, that will raise your hand. And then please also remember to unclick it. And if you would like to have what we call a finger, that is a follow-up question on something which has just been asked, the best way to do that is to type finger in the chat. So where there is the conversation, if you type finger there, and then I will do my best to catch your finger. I cannot assure you it will be 100% accurate, but I will do my best. So Jessica.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Jan. That was really, really, really interesting, really clearly set out, and sort of done in a really engaging way. And it's been useful for me because I work on the other side of the Indian idealisms a bit more, on the schools that you mentioned, Advaita, and their two subsidiary schools. And you've shown me that, in fact, there are mirrors, if you like, in the two different idealist sets of positions, broadly aligned with Buddhist and Hindu, so that we've got a subjective idealism of a kind of a one single subject, and we've got what you might call a material idealism, in which there's a structured world in which everything is made of mind. These two options for idealism, you've shown that they exist both as a Buddhist tradition and debate and as a Hindu one as well, which is fascinating to me. You've also shown, I think, how this discussion is rooted in issues about epistemology, essentially, about what we can and cannot use our empirical observations about the world, our inferences from them, to causal sources, if you like. How much it's rooted in those epistemological questions, and you've really helpfully charting the way in which they're using these things to address these issues. And you brought out, I think, the way in which really central to so many of these debates, both in Indian idealism and Indian ontology, are the issues of what kind of inferences are valid, and then also analogically, how far you can extend certain kinds of inferences. And so the way that it is or isn't valid to say, certain kinds of one set of data and another set of data can validly be transferred, if you like, to other certain kinds. And here, obviously, that's the question I'm about to ask, is to do with what kinds of events and what kinds of agency causers do go together and how far we can apply that. So it's a really interesting reflection and helps sort of lens upon the way that they use that. And as I go into the question, so interesting as well, because of course, a lot of your work, you're known for working on radical anti-foundationalism in Indian ontology. So the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, who, of course, according to various interpretations, either say that there are no existing things, or there are no essences, actual identities or natures, and that therefore we need to kind of, if you like, bring down the status of our conventional ontologies. And I'll be curious to see as we go through this discussion whether the Yogacara position you've shown us in Ratnakirti, where already he's pushing aside certain kinds of inference by which we would normally structure our analysis of the way the world works causally and objectively, that's already being demoted. And so I'd be interested to see whether this Yogacara position stops short of the radical anti-foundationalism for which your work is known. So I've got many questions, and I'll put most of them aside. Also about this endpoint that you make about the conventional versus ultimate distinction. So perhaps I'll get a chance to come back to that. But first, I just really want to put forward a question that's about clarifying one aspect of what pushes Ratnakirti to the position that he chooses. It seems that Dharmakirti accepts the inference that certain kinds of events are actions, i.e., certain kinds of events are caused by a volitional state. And it seems that he makes that inference on the basis of being to immediately perceive the volitional state that causes them. So we have empirical access to both the causer and the caused. And that's really, really interesting. So I can perceive that conjunction. And the issue here is that Ratnakirti, and what I want to know is whether Ratnakirti accepts that leap, whether he does accept that we can say, yes, I see certain events happening in the world that seem to align, to have a positive and negative concomitance, as they say in India, with my own intentional states. Does he accept that? Given that he doesn't seem to accept that I can analogously apply that to things outside myself. So one imagines that Ratnakirti sits here. One version of this is he sits here and he says, I just saw the pen fall on the ground and I can see it aligned with my will. That's definitely a causal conjunction. But then you can see Ratnakirti seeing someone over there dropping the pen on the ground. And he says, well, I just saw the same kind of set of events. And certain things about them looked exactly like the same kind of event that I would normally classify as an action. But I can't access the causer, so the analogy won't work, right? That's what I take him to be saying. My initial question is just, does he accept the initial part of it? Does he accept that even though there are no other minds, whenever I see the pen drop and I access my experience, it means that I am causing it? And so the other events that look like actions out there are just happenstances of circumstance, right? So does he accept the first part? And how does he explain other kinds of things that appear to be caused by agents?
Right. Yeah, thank you, Jessica. That's yeah, there's a lot in there, so I'll try to keep it concise. The main issue in the problem that you've noted is that in order to get the kind of inference going that Dharmakirti wants to get going, we need to establish this inferential pattern of positive and negative correlation in the same way in which we have to establish it in the case of the fire and the smoke in order to get the inference going. Now, Ratnakirti says you can't really get that going in the case of other people's volitions simply because you can never observe them. Now, he doesn't have an issue with that working in your own case, because you can observe both your own mind and by introspection, and also what happens subsequently, so by perception when you see the pen drop or something. So there isn't any problem in using that as an inference in your own case. It only becomes problematic when you use it in the case of another person. However, of course, the question arises, why would you want to infer that you have a mind yourself when you are already able to ascertain that by introspection? Yeah, so it seems to be that in the case of your own mind, the inference is purely superfluous. However, there's an interesting twist to the whole tale, because if you then ask yourself, okay, so what kind of conception do I actually have of my own mind for Ratnakirti, if you assume that you can only have a conception of something as being different from something else if you can see both sides? Yeah. So the conception of my own mind by introspection must be something quite different from the conception of my own mind that I usually assume as having, because I usually identify myself in contradistinction to all the other minds around me, right? I think this is my mind and all the other people around me. However, if I can't even rationally make sense of them, then the perception I would have of my own mind is very, very different. Now, what kind of position that ends up with is a very complex one, and I think one that needs more investigation. In particular, what is puzzling is how all of that relates to the other form of other forms of idealism in the classical Indian schools that you have mentioned. And at the very end of Ratnakirti's text, there is this tantalizing reference to saying, well, but isn't all you've been saying just Vedanta, right, with this one supermind? And then Ratnakirti, of course, explicitly says, no, it's not. But to work out precisely what the reason for that is not as clear as what one might have hoped. So there is certainly a lot more exegetical work to be done.
Can I just complete the thought and then I'll hand over to everyone else? But that's really helpful, this issue of kind of how he does actually construe the self who creates those actions. How does he explain actions or events that happen that look action-like, or indeed any events potentially, that are not caused by oneself? They're presumably part of the same mind, but they're not caused by the will of that mind. What are they caused by?
So what you mean what we would usually call actions of other people, right? You drop your pen, things like that. Yeah. Well, they are, I mean, the only cause that's on offer is my mind, right? So, I mean, that is why it looks like a defense of solipsism, because in the end, it all goes back to your own mind, even though you don't have the introspective capacity of seeing yourself cause that, right? Because you obviously, when you drop your pen, I don't see in my own mind the intention of making you drop your pen. However, the argument would still be that that is what is going on, because there is no other mind around to cause it. And according to the Buddhist picture of the world, everything has a cause. It's not that things just happen randomly. So if everything has to have a cause, and the only cause that you have going around is my mind, then it has to be me.
So we have both self-aware and non-self-aware actions of the one self. Fascinating.
Yes. Apart from the fact, of course, there is no self, right, for the Buddhists.
Reflexive and non-reflexive actions.
Yes.
Non-self.
The non-self, yes.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions. The first one, Andrew Brackau.
Sure. Hi, Professor Westerhoff. Thank you for your very insightful talk. Perhaps you may find this an interesting question. At least I would hope to. You kind of briefly mentioned in a segment of your talk something about this kind of analysis of the I, however it is causally or psychologically related to the notion of I or the self. And then you also kind of spoke with rather about the kind of Madhyamakas responding by saying that even this kind of analysis of an I doesn't withstand sort of ultimate reality, whatever that may mean exegetically. But how would you contextualize this in the doctrines of rebirth, for example, right? Because as far as causal efficacy is concerned, mind streams would undergo the same process of rebirth, whereas the Yogacarins, depending on the subschool of Yogacaras as well, but the Yogacarins would likely say that there is some sort of I consciousness or sixth consciousness that undergoes rebirth, whereas Madhyamikas tend to be even skeptical towards that kind of aspiration and perhaps take an even minimal claim by saying something along the lines of not even that itself would undergo rebirth, but there has to be some sort of amalgamation of aggregates that would take a certain kind of form based on past actions. So how do you think this kind of discussion between Madhyamakas criticizing the notwithstanding analysis of the I and the Yogacara affect perhaps divergent views of the doctrines of rebirth? Thank you.
Right. Yes, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. So, of course, both the Yogacarins and the Madhyamikas accept the Buddhist non-self theory. So, for neither of them there is anything like the Hindu Atman, like substantial permanent soul that goes from life to life, right? So they agree on negating that. However, the Yogacarin says, okay, so we somehow have to explain how rebirth and the transmission of karma works. And they do that via the theory of the foundational consciousness and the karmic traces. So what happens is that every time you do an intentional action, you drop this karmic seed into your mind, and at some point in time in the future, this matures as an experience. Now, however, this foundational consciousness is not anything like a permanent or stable I. Rather, it is like all entities, momentary. It only exists for a really, really short moment, and just before it goes out of existence, it causes the next moment of the foundational consciousness. And in this causal process, it also copies all the seeds, right? So everything that is there in potential in one moment is going to be copied to the next moment, but it's always a different moment. Yeah. So you have this kind of blip-like succession of minds that go through different lives, And it's only because our temporal resolution is very coarse that we don't see the blips, so to speak. We regard it as one continuous sequence. And now the important point about Yogacara is they think that this kind of process is ultimately real, right? This is what is at the rock bottom of reality. You have these foundational consciousnesses with their seeds, and on the basis of this, you can explain rebirth and karma and succession through lives. Now, the Madhyamakas argue that, yeah, there has to be a causal process for explaining how rebirth works. Sure, that's what Buddhists call dependent origination, but none of these processes have any claim to be regarded as an ultimately true theory of the world, right? All of this karma, rebirth, move through lives, and so on only exists at the level of conventional reality. Yeah? At the level of ultimate reality, this all dissolves into emptiness. Yeah? And so this is the key distinction between the Yogacara view and the Madhyamaka view. That the Yogacharans will say, yes, there is a fundamental level of ultimate reality. It is, for example, that everything is mental, and there's the foundational consciousness and so on. And the Madhyamaka will object to that and say, no, there's no fundamental of reality. We only have the level of conventional reality, and we can explain things at the level of conventional reality. But we mustn't think that our philosophical analyses, if they dig deep enough, will ever reach an ultimate rock bottom, because there isn't such a thing.
If I can.
Yes, if you like, briefly, yes.
Yes. So as a quick follow-up, but what would the Madhyamaka say particularly about our conscious insight into this ultimate? Because there also tend to be discussions about whether or not the primal insight that we have is conceptual or perceptual. I'm thinking more of the debates between Jitun, Chokid Gyaltsen, and Jerimpoche and so forth, where there seems to be some debates about what does this dissolution of emptiness actually mean in relationship to other minds, because as you said, there is this risk of ending up with this creeping monism that is happening without necessarily justifying it, but then at the same time they have to defend the neither one or many disjunctive paradox of other minds. So then what actually happens in this ultimate reality, whatever it may mean, as far as the presence or absence of other minds?
Right. Well, I mean, to the extent that you are asking me what the world looks like from the perspective of a Buddha, I don't think I'm able to help. But just still to try to answer the question to some extent, and at least you were referring here to Tibetan interpretations of Madhyamaka, like Jerimpoche and so on. So the idea is there that you set up this whole philosophical process of analysis in order to construct a kind of simulacrum or simile of insight into emptiness. And then you use meditative practice in order to turn that into a direct realization, to turn it from the conceptual level into something which becomes a kind of a cognitive default mode, as something, a way in which you automatically see reality without regarding it as a kind of a philosophical construct, but by internalizing it to such an extent that it becomes your automatic view of the world. Now, what that looks like from the inside when you are in that state, I have no idea, unfortunately. But it's quite clear that if this simulacrum has anything to do with the realization later, is that it can't involve any kind of substantial entities like substantial minds or eternal Atmans of the kind you, for example, find in idealistic systems like Vedanta.
Thank you very much. We have a question now from Anita.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Hi, Jan. Can I just ask you for a little bit more on your final, as it were, solution to this, how you put a wedge between Dhammakirti and Ratnakirti? Can you just say a little bit more about what conventional truths are? Because my understanding of them is pretty rough and ready. And I'm just wondering whether, given certain understandings of what a conventional truth is, I'm not sure I understand the difference between brittle and robust.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes. So, of course, I mean, the theory of true truth is something that you'll find in many forms of Buddhist philosophy, and different schools describe them or analyze them in different ways. But I think for present purposes, we can regard a conventional truth as anything that works in our practical everyday dealings with the world, right?
Okay.
So these are statements like, for example, the statements of the truth of geometry I've given there, and also statements like, there are other beings apart from me, and today's Wednesday, and all of those kinds of statements. So they all work.
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
So that distinguishes them from conventional falsehoods, like assuming that today is Thursday and London is the capital of France, and so on and so on. So that's the difference between conventional truth and conventional falsehood. Now, and then we've got the final bit in the mix, of course, the ultimate truth. So this is usually regarded as the way reality looks like from the perspective of an enlightened mind. So how the Buddha sees the world, that's the perspective of ultimate truth. And of course, we can say relatively little about what that is like without actually becoming enlightened ourselves. So let's put that to one side. Now, my suggestion was here to differentiate somewhat more at the level of conventional truth. And as I mentioned, this is not a distinction you find explicitly drawn in the text. This is a kind of later rationalization I'm suggesting as making sense of what is going on, because I think if we don't draw that distinction, it's very hard to see where Dharmakirti and Dharmakirti actually disagree. So the distinction I was trying to draw is between conventional truth that hold up for a significant amount of conventional analysis and those that don't. So we have some conventional truth that we can classify as truth insofar as they really work in the contexts of everyday reality, like two events simultaneously for me are also simultaneous for any other observer, or the stuff about the triangles, or we might want to say ideas about there being minds other than ourselves. Yeah? And now the idea is that these are brittle conventional truth, but not robust truth, because once we start digging a bit more by conventional means, that's the important point. So we investigate these conventional truths by reflecting more about how these conventions work in terms of logic and introspection and how we prop up logical inferences. Then we realize that these truths are either not true or they don't hold with full generality, right? Of course, the examples I've given there from physics, they are true in specific circumstances, usually at small distances, but they break down once we generalize or we switch to a different kind of space. Whereas in the case of Dharmakirti, if he were to say that the existence of other minds is a conventional truth, but it's a brittle one, then you would want to say that, well, it's a conventional truth that is necessary to take on board for all the ordinary reasons of facilitating interaction with the world. So you need to take that conventional truth on board. However, it's not a conventional truth that sustains a lot of weight being put on it, or that sustains a lot of conventional analysis. Once you actually dig a bit deeper, you realize there are problems, and then you realize that it actually turns out to be a falsity. That's the kind of distinction I wanted to draw here.
Good, that was really clear, but I'm not sure I see the similarity with the one example you give.
No.
Which is the example of the sum of the interior angles.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm just trying to think, okay, so it works for every day and for soteriological considerations that other minds exist.
Yeah.
So we treat people with respect, we talk to them, we teach them, etc. Okay. So what's the kind of analogy to but not on the surface of a sphere? So the analogy is supposed to be but not if you really think about it.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, but that seems different from what not on the surface of a sphere. That's that it works here, but not here. It sounds more like you're saying it doesn't work. It's false.
Yeah. I mean, it's. I don't think I want to put too much weight again on the analogy of these examples. But okay, let me try to explain for what I had in mind here. So in the case of the geometrical example, you have the case of something working on the of course the example actually works on the surface of the sphere, because the Earth is a sphere. It's just when we are looking at relatively small bits of the sphere, then they look pretty flat. So the difference is so minute that it never actually shows up in any measurement. Yeah? So to that extent it works even when we are on a sphere, but it only shows up once if the region of the sphere we are looking at is significantly small. And the same about the second example I've mentioned about the simultaneous events. That also works when we are all in one reference frame, but when we are considering vast distances and observers that move relative to one another, then that all breaks down, right? So it's still true in the same universe. We are not sort of switching to another space or another reality, but we are taking more into account, right? So we're making the distance is very large, and we are moving things to one another. And once we add all these moving pieces, we realize that the original truth don't hold anymore. Yeah. So that's the analogy I was trying to bring in with Ratnakirti. Reflecting on how logical inferences work. Yeah, and he says, okay, so once you actually reflect on how an inference is justified by having this patterns of absence and presences, you realize that in the case of other minds in another person, you can't actually have that. Yeah. Now, I completely agree with you that that is not a perfect analogy. Yeah. But all I was trying to do here was trying to come up with a differentiation of conventional truths such that Ratnakirti and Dharmakirti could both be saying that other minds exist conventionally but not ultimately, which they both seem to be saying in these texts, and at the same time thinking that they disagree with each other, right? Because Ratnakirti obviously envisages his treatise as a refutation of the argument from analogy. Yeah, so that was the kind of differentiation I was trying to introduce in order to understand how Ratnakirti's text actually relates to Dharmakirti.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. We have two fingers on this question, one from Jessica and one from Andrew. So if you like, Jessica, first to ask your follow-up question.
Very briefly, and really just an extension of what was being asked there. It sounds from what you've just said that actually the brittle conventional truth is really just an incomplete truth, right? It's simply to say that it's the case that the triangle sums create two right angles isn't really a truth. It's just an incomplete truth or a partial truth. And that's the only thing that really is making the difference between the brittle and the robust version. And what you're really pointing to is the way in which we can deal with partial truths and often get away with it. But actually, there's a real problem. There's a genuine fallacy in pretending that they're the whole truth. Is it right that they could come down to more or less the same thing? And probably I am kind of questioning whether that does apply then to the distinction between Dharmakirti and Ratnakirti's view on the selves. But that's another issue. Could we just call it partial truths and complete truths?
Yeah. I don't know whether that is something which would work well for the Ratnakirti-Dharmakirti distinction. But whether it works well for these physics example, of course, depends on whether you, for example, think that something like Newtonian mechanics is a partial truth relative to relativistic mechanics, right? And now that is a somewhat complex question. In order to answer that, I think we have to look at lots of other discussions within the philosophy of science about how different theories that contradict one another are related or can be regarded as in some way still talking about the same world. So I'm not entirely sure how much intellectually weight I want to put on my examples, right? They're simply meant to illustrate something in the general vicinity like that. But I don't think I would want to sign up for the claim that the distinction between Dharmakirti and Ratnakirti works in exactly the same way as the distinction, say, between geometry on a plane and on a sphere.
Andrew, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, thank you. How do you think we can ground these sorts of axiological commitments into perhaps Western philosophy of science? Do these commitments look closer to Kant's a priori framework in the sense of these are non-negotiable tautologies, or is it something closer along the lines of Quine's nihilistic views on language and so forth, where even the very foundation and grounding and whatever explanatory power these descriptions have, however persuasive they may at some point in our empirical evolution not withstand some sort of analysis? Is it which one of these is it closer towards?
Right. Well, I think if you look at the Kantian picture, I think you get a nice analogy there with the idea that these views somehow present the framework for how we structure our experience and are therefore necessary for having the kind of experience that we have at all. Yeah, but the Buddhists have a slightly different answer to where they came from, right? So from if you have the Yogacara perspective, then the reason we have these kind of framework ideas or framework assumption or whatever you might call them is because our minds have the kind of karmic tendencies embedded in them that they do, right? And so that all goes all the way back through beginningless ignorance, all the way back through samsara, right? So we are stuck with these kinds of minds which are embedded in conventional truth, and really it's the interaction of our mind that really spans up and makes up conventional truth, but without assuming that this gives these framework assumptions or a priori truth in this context any sort of roots in the way the world really is, right? All that shows us is that there are very general characteristics that flow out of the way our minds are structured, and the way our minds are structured is fundamentally due to the kind of karmic potentials we have, and the explanation for that is lost in the beginningless ignorance of the cycle of samsara.
Thank you. I have a question myself, and this relates to the very end of your talk, when you have presented what is the ultimate truth, or the example of the ultimate truth, not only for this specific brand, if I understood correctly, not only for this specific brand of Buddhism, but more generally for Buddhism as such, and that is all things are without self. Now, this seems to suggest that solipsism is false, not because the existence of other minds is a merely conventional truth, but in a deeper way because there is no self to start with. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, you were mentioning Descartes, but for Descartes, of course, the self is a big ego. And here seems to be a completely different framework in which the ultimate reason why solipsism is false comes down to this ultimate truth.
Thank you. Yes, that is a very important point. And so I think we'll have to differentiate between two different ways of phrasing the solipsistic position. So one is the familiar Cartesian style. There's the res cogitans, there's the thinking thing, the substance, and that is real, and everything else is sort of a projection from that. Or we can have a more general understanding that says, well, all the other minds are only projections from mental events, or a projection onto mental events. They don't have any existence on their own. However, that leaves the status of myself, of the ipse that is the center of solipsism, untouched. We don't make any assumptions about that. And in fact, the Buddhists went one step further than that. They would say, look, there isn't a substantial self. There is no Atman, right? So I am as insubstantial as anything else. Yeah. So what the form in which the question of solipsism then arose for those thinkers was the question of whether there are minds other than myself, right? So even if I am not substantially real, even if I am in a kind of a Humean manner, mainly a bundle of perceptions and thoughts and ideas that are sort of causally connected, it's because one long causal flow, but without any sort of central backbone running through all of that. If that's what I am, that still leaves open the question of whether other people exist independently of me, or whether they are simply projections on the basis of my mental events. Yeah? And depending on the answer you give, you either have a realist view of other minds, or you have a form of solipsism. But this kind of solipsism that you get there is very, very different from the kind of solipsism you get in the post-Cartesian tradition, because it's a form of solipsism that also doesn't take the self seriously and doesn't assume that there is a central ego at the center from which all the rest of reality is projected.
Thank you. Other questions, or perhaps it is high time that we let Jan rest after this really splendid lecture. And in normal times at this point, I would say, please join us in the foyer, in the magnificent foyer of the Maison Française for a drink, a cup of wine, for a chat. And unfortunately, we cannot do this today, but not even in some meaningful virtual way. But still, I would like to thank Jan really very, very much for this lecture, and Jessica for her comments at the beginning and for joining us today, and everybody else for being here for this annual lecture of the British Society for the History of Philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So virtual applause to Jan. I'm sure everybody